You've worked closely with leaders like Philippe Cortot and Steve Jobs. What was the experience like?
If you don't put your photo up, I'm going to fire you. Especially Pixar, when I joined, you can imagine there was a lot of pressure on the studio to not be a one-hit wonder, right? They didn't just want to have Toy Story. And so I was diagnosed at stage 3 and had over $1 million of treatment that took a huge collateral damage on my person. The human aspect is incredibly important. Imagine if you had a radiologist reading your mammogram who had a newborn perhaps and didn't have much sleep and hasn't had their second cup of coffee. What if you could have that backed up by an AI diagnostics tool and the other thing I believe AI will do is it'll free up doctors to have more connection directly with the patient.
Welcome back to Byte Happens, the podcast where we explore big ideas in tech in a way that connects with everyone. I'm Flavia Taborga, and today we're recording our first in-person episode from Portland, Oregon. I'm joined here by Katherine Singson. Katherine has had a remarkable career. She's based in Silicon Valley, and she has worked alongside some of the most influential figures in tech. She has led teams at major tech companies, and later she served in C-suite roles across many industries, including health tech, AI, financial services, among others. In this conversation, we'll explore technology, storytelling, branding, and global leadership. Katherine, welcome to Byte Happens.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
You started off your career at an AI company when the field was far less visible to the public than what it is today. What was it like to work at an AI company back then?
Well, it was very different. And I'm going to age myself very quickly here. We're talking the 80s. And the time back then was relational databases were producing large amounts of information, lots of free text and data. And so what we called ourselves was an information search and retrieval engine. And so how do you find trends within that information without having to read it? And so, it was a remarkable time. And I actually ended up working at that startup for 5 years, which I think is fairly unusual these days. And we hired some of the most remarkable engineers, and we grew up together. We worked so hard, and it was just like you imagine. Like sometimes people would sleep under their desks, and they shipped us all over the U.S. and the world sometimes to bring this to market. And so for me, it was such an extraordinary learning opportunity. And I'm still friends with many of the people from that time in my life. It's wonderful. And many of them have gone on to great success, as you can imagine.
And when you look back, what key skills you think helped you navigate and thrive in an industry that was evolving so rapidly?
I used to call it the Take an Engineer to Lunch program. I think if you could really understand the technology and break it down and discuss it at a level that, I used to joke, could my mother understand this technology? My job as a marketer was to really hone it down and synthesize it so that we could market in a way that anyone could really understand it, and especially these sort of groundbreaking technologies. And so really having a curious mind, asking simple questions, and trying not to just go down rabbit holes, but making sure that you use a simple, elegant language to describe things. Because first I was marketing AI, then we were marketing object-oriented development environments. I think it's this idea of really getting things down to their essence.
You worked closely with leaders like Philippe Cortot and Steve Jobs. What was the experience like?
Near the end of that 5 years, they brought in Philippe Cortot, and Philippe was quite a personality, quite mercurial Frenchman, and I think he rubbed some people the wrong way, probably just like Steve. But he was great. We didn't cross over that much, but enough to have an impact. And he was lovely, and kind of kept tabs on me, and we remained friends throughout my career until he passed. And so also I think he prepped me for Steve at some way. And so I actually got headhunted after 5 years to, I grew up in the Bay Area, and so I knew who Steve Jobs was. I knew what NeXT Computer was. It was his second endeavor after Apple. And they had failed, and being in Silicon Valley and having a lot of friends who were engineers, they would have spent their hard-earned cash buying a NeXT slab or a NeXT cube, but it did not hit mass market, right? And so to save the company, they had to take the operating system out of the box and sell it into corporate America. And so they were looking for a team to help them do that. And my background at Verity, this first startup that I was at, was perfect for NeXT. And so with all the bravado of a 26-year-old, I told that headhunter, I'm like, listen, you get me that interview and I'll get the job. And she really laughed because they'd had a rough time trying to find a good fit. But anyway, one thing led to another. And I didn't work directly for Steve initially. I was several layers down. But I was very lucky to interview with the woman who was leaving. She was actually having her second child. So I asked her a lot of questions about how to maneuver and how to best succeed. And I followed a lot of her advice to the letter. And within, I would say, 6 months, I was working directly for Steve. And that was an amazing experience. I mean, we basically, over the course of 3 years, grew it. It's hard to remember the exact numbers, but from 0 to 50 million into corporate America and government agencies. And from there, it's history now, but we sold it back to Apple. And if you'd like some more interesting stories on that front, I had just gone to New York for Jacob Javits to do a trade show there, and we were exhibiting across from Amazon at the time. We're talking, I think it was 96, 97, it's a long time ago. And they had their booth employees dressed as Tarzan and Jane. I kid you not. It's changed a bit. But anyway, Steve said, hey, get back on the next plane. I need you here. And so I'm like, but, and he's like, no, get back here. And he goes, and come right into the office. And so he sat a small team of us down and said, okay, over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to sell NeXT back to Apple. And it needs to be all top secret because it's a stock swap at some level. And so, yeah, that was an amazing experience. And, most people don't realize, but Steve was not coming back as the CEO. This is a long time ago. He was coming back as a part-time consultant. And so these were his exact words to me. He said, Katherine, Apple is in a death spiral. Yeah, those were his exact words. He goes, I'm about to sign a 5-picture deal with the Walt Disney Company, because at that point he'd had the success of Toy Story, they'd IPO'd. And he goes, why don't you come with me to Pixar? We'll make movies. It'll be fun, And how do you say no to that? Exactly. Yeah. And so I walked away from all that Apple stock, hindsight. But, it was such a privilege, and it was also an amazing adventure.
And I imagine both NeXT and Pixar were facing major strategic pressure. How was it like to operate in that environment?
Well, especially Pixar, when I joined, you can imagine there was a lot of pressure on the studio to not be a one-hit wonder, right? They didn't just want to have Toy Story. And so they were also in the process of how do you market a major blockbuster film? These films take 4 years to make and a lot of money and hundreds of people. And so so I became the head of marketing and publicity for Pixar. And we were, again, in partnership, a very rare 50-50 deal with the Walt Disney Company. And so a lot of times I'm tracking like 13 vice presidents at Disney. It was challenging. And, we were definitely, we had the goods, but they were Disney. And so there was a lot of pressure on everyone's personality and a lot of stress. And then right in the middle of it all, and, thank goodness, but Steve got pulled back to Apple full time. And even though he called himself the CEO, interim CEO initially, I really didn't have much of his time at Pixar initially because he was busy saving Apple, to use his exact words.
Right. And what was it like being on the team that was working on reshaping Steve Jobs' public image and public communication?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a lot of pressure. I think, and then also when Steve joined Apple, people don't realize, he had to do major restructuring and layoffs, and, he went through a lot of stress as well. And so, we worked a lot. And I think something to realize for every person like Steve Jobs, or, I'm certain for Elon Musk and everyone else, is there's hundreds, if not thousands of people working really, really hard behind the scenes. And, he was really lucky to have lots of really good people, both at Apple, at Pixar, at NeXT over the years. For every person like that, there are thousands of people working very, very hard. Yeah, it's a team. I think I felt it, and I think anyone that worked with him felt it, but you could feel that you were in the company of greatness. He definitely had a vision. He had the ability to articulate things and to really, again, get them down to their elegant essence. And so at NeXT, when we were in the process of sort of rebuilding it, from basically the lowest point to being able to sell it back to Apple, he could see the internet coming, and think about like Netscape and what was going on then. And so he had this vision of how things should work. And so, for example, we used NeXT Mail in the office, and he had a feature in NeXT Mail where you should have your photo next to your email. And I remember when I first started, I didn't want to put my photo. And he said, he kept asking me to put my photo, and I kept not doing it. And so finally he said, if you don't put your photo up, I'm going to fire you. But think about photos today, like Instagram, and how important they are, And then even with the internet, when I was kind of slow to adopt it, and he said, okay, tomorrow I want you to show me your 3 favorite websites. And so he sort of pulled me forward. And, I think part of why it worked is I was so young, and, I was not afraid of anything. If he said he wanted a cover of a magazine, I'm like, okay, let me see what I can do. And, he tried several times to bring in people above me that were more experienced, and, they would only last for a little while. And so it was just the time in our lives and the dynamism of that. And anyway, he definitely went back to Apple, as you can imagine, and I stayed at Pixar for, probably 3 years.
Right. And at the time, Pixar was still deeply rooted in technology, computer graphics. What did it take, or how was it like to translate that technical foundation into a brand that resonated far beyond just the tech and still does today?
Well, I would say, while Steve is a tech person, the people that were, the heart and soul of Pixar, they would say that their main job is storytelling, right? And computers don't tell stories, people tell stories. It's not like you tell the computer to make a feature-length film. For each film, there are incredible artisans and experts and writers and technology people creating the tools to create that film. And one of the early ways he sort of lured me to Pixar when I was still at Apple is he invited me to a Pixar offsite. And I remember they were thick into this discussion on how to animate hair, skin, and fire. I think it was fire. And I just remember thinking, this is amazing. This is fun. And nowadays you can animate almost anything. But back then, we're talking quite a while ago, something as organic as skin and hair and fire. I just thought, this is cool. Really cool.
Yeah, I can imagine. I want to talk about your time in Australia. How was it to work in a totally different culture?
Yeah. So I went off on my own world quest, right? And I lived in Europe for a while, and eventually I found myself in Australia. And my partner at the time was smart. He said, I think you need to go back into your career. And so, ironically, I told Steve, I said, hey, I'm going to stay in Australia, because he was lovely. He kept offering me jobs back at corporate, and I don't know, it just didn't feel right to go back. And so he actually called the head of Apple Australia, and so he hooked me up with a few different headhunters. And the irony is that a headhunter called me and said, hey, would you ever consider going to Microsoft? I know, Microsoft. And at the time, I said, well, there's only one department within Microsoft that I think is doing something really interesting, and that was their consumer division, which was Xbox. And so he laughed and he said, that's exactly what it's for. And so I did a whole, series of interviews, and I was very lucky they created a consumer marketing role for me there.
Right. Yeah. Did you experience any culture shocks?
Yes. I mean, I think people think of Australia as being like America, and in certain ways it is. We do sort of speak the same language, but culturally they're quite different. And so, for example, as an American of my generation, we're taught to be very politically correct, right? And in Australia, they would do this thing they call taking the piss out of each other. Yeah, I know it sounds kind of... Yeah. Anyway, which is basically teasing you. And so I remember getting on an elevator with a group of my colleagues, and they're teasing me, like mercilessly teasing me. And I had one other female colleague, and she could see the look in my face. And so she leans over and she goes, Katherine, it's okay. It means they like you. And I was like, oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, it was very different, that you could take a lot more risks in Australia with regard to your marketing. It was Xbox, so it was going after a certain demographic. So I had to kind of be at the mercy of some of my agencies and some of the people that had been there for a while. Yeah.
And now you're working at Apple's major competitor?
Well, you can imagine so very different. One, when I was working with Steve, I'm like working right directly for the brain, right? And so you're getting all your direction from his vision. And so that was very different. And, he was still very much embarking on this amazing comeback that we all know today, right? Which is brilliant. And, I was lucky to stay close with him throughout that time. And, we'd have lunch at least, once a year. But at Microsoft, I have to say, Australia was a fantastic subsidiary. It was quite high profile, despite at the time, I think maybe we had like 22, 23 million people. But it was very influential in that, a lot of Asia Pacific looked to it. And so, yeah, we could take a lot of risks. We could do a lot of fun things, and we could really set the tone. But I think the thing that was really shocking for me is that so many of my American colleagues really had no concept of what it was like. Like, for example, they would say, okay, and here's your back to school campaign for Australia. They didn't realize that back to school is a whole different thing there. They have a different rhythm to their business. Or, for example, they'd launch a Xbox game with an actor or an actress from a U.S. television program, and that television program hasn't even launched in Australia yet. Right. And so they'd be like, here, look at this amazing ad, which would just completely go over the heads of Australians. They have no idea who this person is. And so there was a lot of education that I had to do to kind of help them see the opportunity.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine. And then you continued working as a consultant?
So after I finished that, I decided, it's almost been a decade. It's been a little over a decade now that I came back to the U.S. My younger brother was about to have his first child, and I wanted to be there for that. And so I came back and I worked as a consultant. And, one of the cool aspects of my career is I was able to apply my marketing skills and my strategy, I would call it strategic thinking, almost like management consulting, to a lot of different industries. And so I worked in financial services, outsourcing. I even did some real estate tech. I did a lot of different things over the years, and that was fascinating. But probably the most jarring thing that happened to me over this decade, completely out of the blue, is 7 years ago, when I was feeling amazingly healthy, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so that has taken me on a wholly different path of survival. But one thing it did is I got to see the very worst and perhaps the best of our healthcare system here in the U.S. I was treated in Silicon Valley. And let me tell you, there's plenty of room for improvement. And so, the sad thing is there were so many clues to my breast cancer over the times, for probably a decade leading up to my diagnosis, and yet it was completely missed. Even though I was asking the right questions, I was pawned off or told not to worry about it. I wasn't given access to my imagery or my record. People didn't take me seriously. And, for me, I'm a native English speaker. I can't imagine what it would be like for people that maybe didn't have the privilege of being a native English speaker or, any other challenge. And so anyway, I would say my great passion now is to take this incredible career that I've had and leverage this strategic thinking about technology and put it into making our healthcare system far better. Because I think what I went through, no one needs to go through that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And now that we're talking about your passion, how do you see AI improving the patient's journey?
On so many levels. I think, one specific example is right after I finished the mainstay of my treatment, right when COVID broke out, I initially did a consulting job for an AI diagnostics firm in breast cancer, ironically. And so imagine there are so many different applications for AI, but, while I think that the human aspect is incredibly important, imagine if you had a radiologist reading your mammogram who had a newborn perhaps and didn't have much sleep and hasn't had their second cup of coffee. What if you could have that backed up by an AI diagnostics tool that was very precise, and so you could actually, cross those two over and have the best of both worlds. And the other thing I believe AI will do is it'll free up doctors to have more connection directly with the patient. I mean, I'm of the generation where I spent, if you're lucky to get 20 minutes with your doctor, I don't know, every 6 months. In my time, they're mostly desperately trying to enter information into the electronic health record. They don't even look in your eye. And it's hard to get mad at them because, they're at the mercy of this as well. But imagine now if you can have AI scribes and they can just proofread it at the end of a meeting, and they actually look and listen to you, because I told the doctors what was wrong with me, but they didn't hear me because they were desperately trying to perhaps enter the data, and they didn't actually see me.
Right. So a lot of people could argue, right, that implementing AI in hospitals would make the relationship between patients and doctors less human. But I actually am getting that it would be exact the opposite, right? Now the AI can take off any busy work or the burden, and now they can be present with the patient and actually listening to them.
Incredibly important busy work. I mean, busy work is, it doesn't justify how important details are. I mean, even my own health record as I went through this, I mean, I would constantly, while I was going through my cancer journey, review my record, and they would often put in the wrong type of cancer, and I'd have to have it corrected each time. They'd make assumptions that were wrong. Another aspect of AI that I think will be amazing is agentic AI. So when I was first diagnosed, I remember my first oncology appointment, they said, you might want to bring someone with you. Well, I was a single girl, right? So I brought a girlfriend with me. You're not only having to deal with drinking from a fire hose of information and the fear that, this is advanced stage cancer, and am I going to survive, and what are my 6 million different choices, and how am I going to get through this? But then you're having to deal with the emotion of that person. And, I think some people might get lucky and they have a great partner or a person that could be, very precise. But imagine if you had an AI agent that was, not only deeply understanding your health plan, but your diagnoses, perhaps your longitudinal health record. I mean, there's so much opportunity, not just for better healthcare, but preventative maintenance, personalized medicine. All these things will benefit from AI. And, there's so many, as we all know, sadly, there's so much inefficiency. There's so much, this is the way we've always done it. The whole thing needs to be turned on its head, and I can't wait for AI to do that.
Yeah. And also, it would make the records and the overall healthcare more affordable and accessible to the patient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it would put, for example, would I have been preferred to be diagnosed at stage 0 or stage 1? Because at that stage, breast cancer is nearly 100% survivable. But instead, I was diagnosed at stage 3 and had over $1 million of treatment that took a huge collateral damage on my person and my finances as well, if I'm honest. And so that's completely needless. They could have caught my breast cancer early. I even asked very leading questions that I was completely given misinformation for, So I just think there's just so much opportunity for improvement, and AI will help on every level, from being able to have a more present doctor, to having a more complete health record, to having more accurate imagery, to have that imagery analyzed with great precision. There's just endless possibilities for AI within our healthcare system, and it's exciting to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, it gives people hope.
It does. And it's a challenging world sometimes these days. So it's wonderful to hang on to hope. I definitely do.
Yeah, beautiful. How has your mindset evolved throughout your journey?
Mm-hmm. I think, and maybe this is what helped me get through my whole, health challenges. I've always sort of taken lots of risks. And so I think it's just put more of that into me, is that life is about jumping in with, both feet and taking lots of risks and giving it your all. And so, now I want to transform this amazing career I've had and take this deep passion I have to make the future better for other people. I just don't think anyone should have to go through what I went through when it can be completely avoided.
Yeah, beautiful. Katherine, this has been such an inspiring conversation. Where can our listeners find more about you?
Mm-hmm. So I'm on LinkedIn, of course, and so you can find me there. I'm sure you can put up my Katherine Singson at LinkedIn. And then I also have a holding site for KYA Health, which is my own little endeavor. It's just a holding site for now, and it's kyahealth.org. And KYA Health is sort of like my best self. KYA, I got it from a book, but it's a diminutive for Katherine.
That's beautiful. Katherine, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And to our audience, thank you again for tuning into Byte Happens. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channels. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, Byte happens.